Okay. Greetings. My name is Alex Forrester. I serve on the board here at the Schumacher Center for New Economics, and I am tremendously excited to welcome everyone here today for the 44th Annual Schumacher Lecture. Thank you, as always, to the incredible team here at Schumacher for your work in organizing such important conversations. Thank you, Paul and Báyò, for proposing this particular encounter. Thank you to the Christopher Reynolds Foundation for your generous support in sponsoring this event. Most importantly, thank you to the thousands of people who are joining us from around the world today. It is morning here in the Berkshires, but our topic is planetary in scope, and so is our audience. So whether you are dialing in over your morning coffee or long after the sun is set, we want to warmly welcome you into this moment, this conversation, and this call. Thank you for joining us. We have an opportunity today to witness and participate together in a rather beautiful engagement. Two prominent, outspoken thinkers coming from very different backgrounds and traditions who have nonetheless discovered each other and new parts of themselves in the warmth of friendship. This is the very first public conversation between Báyò Akómoláfé and Paul Hawken, but it will certainly not be the last. At first glance, it is an unexpected pairing. A post-humanist philosopher on one hand who speaks poetically about monsters and middles, and an environmental leader and social entrepreneur on the other whose books about business and global warming have inspired a generation of activists to leverage practical, hands-on approaches to change. But we are living, as the old saying goes, in interesting times. And as we head into the second half of this most fateful decade amidst rising temperatures and burning forests, there's a growing awareness that the efforts thus far to avert disaster have not succeeded. The data about global warming is overwhelming, and yet the social and political energy required for this moment have not found their way yet along the critical path. It's forcing a new conversation in climate circles, not just of the methods, but of the problem itself. It is this reconsideration that we are invited into dialogue about today. What if the problem isn't how to change the world, stop climate change, or win the fight against carbon emissions? What if that's the wrong question entirely? Perhaps it's time to step back and re-examine the deeper premise of our movement, to question our schemes and strategies, the language we use, and the conceits they betray. Paul and Báyò, each in their own way, find themselves hearing a different rhythm and wanting to respond to a different call. It is coming into focus as a call to wonder, to humility, to appreciate in an entirely new way what being alive really means, what life on Earth is all about, and how it flows and moves beyond human language and comprehension. As Paul reminds us, the Earth itself is not dying. It is humanity that either will or will not have a future. So as the old Irish joke that gives this event its name goes, we can't get there from here. In the time we have together today, we want to unpack what this means, what the implications might be if we were to approach the question of our world and ourselves differently. As Báyò says, in order to find our way, we must start by losing it. The first step involves letting go of where we thought we were in the first place. To start us off, Paul and Báyò are each going to respond with some thoughts on the general theme, we can't get there from here, and then we'll head into a lively discussion on some of the pressing topics that emerge. We have intentionally left our time unscripted and unplanned with the goal of focusing instead on what emerges in the conversation itself. We've left ample time at the end for Q&A, but we also want to invite you to send in questions as they occur to you during the conversation, using the Zoom controls at the bottom of your screen. Our plan is to use the questions to guide and add to the conversation, to find patterns and common concerns that bring us all together in this moment. You may not hear them verbatim, but you will rather notice words and phrases and themes that connect your questions across with others. No matter what, please know that everything you send will be read and shared with the speakers. So with all of that said, let us begin. Paul and Báyò, thank you. Báyò, I'd like to ask you to go first. I will play the part and tee up the joke. We're trying to get to a very important destination, and we're a bit lost at the moment. Would you be so kind as to point the way?
Of course, brother. By losing it. By losing it. Um, Thank you so much, brother. And uh, Paul, it's wonderful to be in conversation with you, truly. Um, and to everyone who's shown up here at this crossroads of some sort, thank you for showing up and being here. And thank you to the Schumacher Center and all our partners making this happen. I am in India and I'm in Chennai, and we've just gone through some tough weather, a cyclone at the moment. And I was just telling my brothers a while ago that the systems are shaky, unstable. So I have offered some prayers to the elements that there are no severe glitches, but this is the time to speak anyway. Through glitches and through crossroads and through cyclones, this is the time to speak and to be with each other. I thought I would start out with a story to situate some of the things and that Paul and I and Alex are sensing about these times, captured eloquently by some of Alex's opening remarks. It's one of my most fascinating stories to tell. It's not my story to tell. It's all our stories to tell. But it's a story about the most desolate place on the planet, hypothetically. It's the most inhospitable region on the planet. It's in the Sahara Desert, and it's called the Bodele Depression. It is supposedly the remnant, the drying out remnant of an ancient lake, which was once the largest lake on the planet, Mega Chad, but it started to dry out about 7,000 years ago. The Bodele Depression is so inhospitable, nothing lives there except the dead bodies of these single-celled creatures called diatoms. Now, I don't know if you've seen a diatom before. I'm sure Paul has some just sprinkled around his desk. But they're exquisitely beautiful. Exquisitely beautiful to see under a microscope. I haven't had the privilege of doing that, but I've seen videos of diatoms. They have these fascinating composition because they live in glass houses. Their bodies are literally made of silica. These things are absolutely crucial to how we breathe and how we live on the planet. So it turns out that every year, a gust of wind, a gale of wind, I'm not exactly sure what kind of wind, but some wind carries dust, about 20,000 tons of dust across the Atlantic Ocean and spanning 10,000 miles, and it deposits the diatoms and their bodies, some falling in the Atlantic Ocean, but most of them reaching the Amazon rainforest. And the 22,000 tons of dust replaces the shedding of dust that the Amazon goes through every year, almost replacing it. But it is vital that this procession happens, or else we would not have the luxuries of breathing that we have today. 22,000 tons of dust over 10,000 miles, dead things giving life. The most inhospitable region, birthing again and again the life on our planet. Now keep that in mind. Keep this brown shawl, let's just call it a pashmina of life that envelopes the planet. Keep that in mind. As I recall, November 17th, I was in Milan when I heard that President Biden had gone to Manaus as the first sitting US president to visit the Amazon rainforest. And he promised lots of stuff, spoke about $11 billion dedicated to conservation, and that the US government, in the wake of Trump, is going to do everything it can to enact laws that protect biodiversity. Good stuff, the stuff that you and I care about, I think. But then I spoke to someone from that place. Well, she wasn't exactly in Manaus, but she was in Milan with me, and we had a conversation, and she told me about what I later started to call the insidious architecture of salvation. Because with Biden and his infrastructural plan and his salvific enterprise came this huge contingency, this huge delegation of researchers and scientists. And all of a sudden, that little space in Manaus was put under a lot of pressure. They had to build new hotels and get new funding for this and that just to host salvation. And I was thinking about and now it's far be it from me to suggest that there is a Puritan way to think about intervention of any kind. But I raised that up. I raised this idea up of this sister that spoke to me in Milan about what's going on, the transformations that are going on in her part of the world in order to respond to change. I bring that up because I think the logic, this is the point here, the logic of the familiar is repeated in the solutions that we prefer to the crisis. And maybe that's why we're here. I'm just going to call it the logic of theirsness. The logic of theirsness. And it's this idea. The idea is so simple. It's so obvious. Most of us buy into it without really critically thinking about it. The logic of theirsness is the idea that we are in a problem, and the thing to do is to move to futural solutions through clear interventions, which is in itself based on the presupposition that we know where we are, we have some idea of where we're going, and all we just need is some philanthropic effort or legislation between to get us from here to there. But I think that idea, that formulaic response fundamentally misunderstands presence. It misunderstands the ways that presence and crisis and response moves in an entangling world, because it presumes that here is just a location. It's just a spot, right? I would beg to differ that here is not just a location. Here is a relation. Here is the diatoms moving across the planet, disturbing the idea, the categoricity of here and there, disturbing the identity of continents, disturbing the idea that of distance. Here is the idea that everything is in touch, that we are in wondrous palimpsestic movements with the world around us, that to distinguish us and to cut us away from the world is to make a fundamental mistake. And so here is more than location. Here is a messy, chaotic, vocation of becoming other. There, on the other hand, is also not a destination, not merely so. It seems to preserve the vocation of mastery. It seems to postpone here. I'm trying to say we're not even here, right? To move from here to there. We're not even here, because here is all about touch, and modernity is the refusal to be in touch. So the solutionistic enterprise seems to be supported by a thesis that is at a critical loss. It doesn't know how to meet this moment. And that's what we want to talk about today. We're here to listen, to get lost together. My people, the Yoruba people, Alex said this a while ago, in order to find your way, you must become lost. I think there's something about being here that invites us to meet ourselves for the first time and to let go of the premise that we're separate, distinct, or removed from the world that we're desperately trying to save, because that logic is no longer working. And with that, I would like to invite Paul. Just before I invite my brother to say something. I grew up reading this man. Um, I grew up watching him on TV, and it's such a humbling thing right now that I'm in conversation with him. The first time we met, it was a gushing, gasping thing we were just in this rhapsody of eloquence and sharing our life stories with each other. And I'm so grateful that I get this chance to speak with you, brother.
Báyò, my goodness, my brother Báyò. First, may I say to you, Alex and David and Susan and Alpha and everybody at the Schumacher Center, thank you so much for bringing Báyò to Schumacher and bringing us together virtually. I'm so grateful for all of you, the work you've done and put into this. And to Báyò, it's so interesting. I was shocked when I heard Báyò say that he had heard, read, or watched me prior, because it's the other way around for me. When writing my latest book, I stumbled upon Báyò in a beautiful, beautiful podcast called Find the Wild. And he was at the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, which is where I grew up on that campus. I was what was called a Berkeley brat and running around. And I was transfixed. And I then proceeded to find every last scrap of podcast or writings that Báyò has shared with the world so generously. And it was really a breakthrough for me in terms of the book. The book is called Carbon, the Book of Life, but because you can plod along as a writer, and I've always said to my friends who are trying to write a book, I said, if it's not painful and difficult, it's not a good book. In other words, if you're not really stretching and otherwise. And it was that, and I just found a haven, like a vestige of wisdom, a way of seeing the world, which is what I was trying to get at as well. I'm not sure we're seeing the world in a way that's helpful to ourselves or others. And I found that in Báyò, and the first quote in my book is, I don't think it was mine, but the one that has my name on it. It's from Báyò, and it says, there are things we must do, sayings we must say, thoughts we must think that look nothing like the images of success that have so thoroughly possessed our visions of justice. And that's how the book begins. And so I just am so honored to be with you. And it's true, when we met on Zoom, and what happened was that my publisher said, well, you have to get permission from Báyò Akómoláfé for that quote. I said, no, it's written down. It's right there. You can see it. I said, and I was intimidated. I thought, oh my gosh, he'll never answer my emails. Anyway, so and of course he responded. And we did have this really wonderful talk.
We did.
Yeah, it just went everywhere. And is out of that talk, this thing you can't get there from here. Emerge, and it's it is an Irish joke. It's legendary, the joke, and if those who don't know it, is really just about two tourists wanting to get to Dublin on a small little road and seeing a crofter, farmer, but leaning against his fence and then asking him for directions, and he listens and he looks longingly to, not longingly, but for the long time to the right, then he looks to the left. And he looks again, and the first thing he says, well, I wouldn't start from here. And then the second thing is, because you can't get there from here. And so for me, we laughed about it epitomizes really what I think our conversation was about what Carbon's about, what Báyò's doing so beautifully in his work around the world. is really re-examining the assumptions that inform the so-called climate movement and the
Right.
concerns about biodiversity, this growing wellspring of human beings who are acutely aware of what's happening and want to do something and be effective. And yet, having been involved with the climate movement since I was, I don't know when, a long time ago, and inspired by Bill McKibben and certainly Al Gore, but Bill McKibben especially in his book At the End of Nature, 1998, I believe it was. And until then, and from then, I felt that there was these experts out there who understood climate very, very well, and that what I would focus on is nature and biodiversity and those subjects, and I would leave that climate to the experts. And what happened, of course, is we all know is that the climate concerns have really become a movement. And my concern about the movement, I've watched it carefully and certainly know many of the players and so forth, but that the movement itself unintentionally embodies the problem. In other words, it's not the solution. And it doesn't, I don't mean to gainsay anybody's work activity or sincerity. That is not what I am doing whatsoever. But I feel like, and I think Báyò has eyes that can see it much better than we can because we in the West, and I'm talking about the West right now, that emerged out of the scientism of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, have a very particular way of seeing the world and understanding it, and it's very atomistic. Our language, English, not our, but that language, has more words than any other language except for maybe Spanish. But the number one language in the world is actually chemistry. The number one language is chemical names that we've invented. And the number two language is plants, the name of plants that we've named. And I think that when the climate movement emerged, it tried to identify, of course, cause. And I'm a part of that. I wrote with researchers all over the world. Excuse me, I'm just going to clear my throat. I wrote and edited a book called Drawdown and then Regeneration, where I was just with my peers and everybody else trying to figure out what are the solutions to reversing global warming and to name it. But at the same time, I was looking at the rhetoric, at the language, and the way we were speaking about this. And it just occurred to me that we were actually using the same terminology, the same verbs, as that are causing the problem, and that is we were othering climate, and that is so apparent in our language. We are fighting and tackling and combating climate change. Well, there's a handful for you. I mean, first of all, I want to say something. Climate is perfect. It always will be. It's the climate, and furthermore, it doesn't care what we think, and it's not in crisis whatsoever. So there's a climate crisis. No, there's not a climate crisis. It is kith and kin with the biosphere. It is the biosphere that has created the atmosphere. And so in talking about it in such a way, we have stepped into or reoccupied these shoes of duality and othering that are really the source of the problem. We've been othering this planet, othering people, othering genders, othering creatures, animals, and so forth. And I say we in the so-called West, and for 500 years. And the results show that's the world we live in. That's the thinking that caused it. And so if we're going to address this in a way that actually, I'd say, includes more people, and then we have to change our language and I have to change our thinking. Because what we've done, and I've look at the polls and so forth, less than 1% of people on Earth are doing anything on a daily basis about climate. It's less than 1%, quite a bit less. And so how could a movement of such importance, after 50 years of understanding the cause and the implications of it, have only garnered less than 1% of the world as being actively involved? Yes, 30, 40%, depending on the country, will say they understand it and they definitely are concerned about it, that's for sure. But in terms of actually on a daily basis, you know, conducting their life and what they buy and what they eat and, you know, what they share in their activity, it's far less than 1%. And I think part of that is because we, and I say we, because I'm part of that movement, you know, have used language that is jargonistic. It doesn't call to people at all. We talked about, you know, carbon neutrality and net zero, you know, these strange terms, you know, teragrams. How many people know what a teragram is? And probably this idea of carbon neutrality is just such a fantastic concept, because the last thing we want is a Earth that's carbon neutral. Carbon is a flow that animates every single aspect of the living world, from the tiniest cell in our brain, you know, to the Amazon, and to everything in between. I mean, it is not just the basis of life, it is the messenger, the memory, the animator of life that we so want to protect and value and, you know, share, and we see it slipping away, you know. And as of the Cali Conference of the Parties in Colombia last month, it was announced that 73% of all mammals have been lost in the last, not counting us, in the last 50 years. So we're on a fast track to to a kind of annihilation, and it's coming from the way we think and the way we talk to each other. And I don't propose that, therefore, I know what to do or I have the solution. That's why I turned to Báyò. Because I feel like, you know, we have to really step back, and not from being active or caring, but step back from the way we've been taught to think and recognize that, you know, our English language definitely the language of nounism. It's got more nouns than you can count, you know, and it's just, but nouns basically are distinctions. It's this and it's not a that. And so when you make distinctions, you get, because it's a beautiful complex world, you get more and more nouns. And but a noun always separates. You can't make a distinction unless there's separation, at least in your mind. And I feel like we came from that point of view, from scientism, from Lewinwach's work in Holland in the 1600s. And, you know, I mean, in so many ways, we've come to that, you know, really extraordinary understanding of the living world, you know, but it also separates us. And really, we have then overrun, let's say we in the West, in the colonial West, have overrun over 5,000 languages in this world, many of which are endangered today, that actually are verb-based. And they're based on verbs and metaphors. And verbs are ways to connect. You can't have a verb unless it connects to something. You know, if you can replicate, or you can hate, you can love, you can, you know, exterminate too. But all verbs really connect us. And so we have a wildly disconnected movement to reverse global warming, and to bring life back to the earth in the biodiversity movement. And that's not, I'm not talking about people's heart or their intention or their sincerity. I'm just talking about what we've inherited as a way of knowing, a way of thinking. And I just am so grateful to Báyò. I call him he's the metaphorical genius in my world. But the way he speaks of it is so clear and so liberating in terms of then for me as a writer in this case, but also as a speaker, to re-examine how I have looked at the world and how I see it. And I feel like we are definitely in a crisis in the sense of a human crisis, a crisis of identity, a crisis of perception, a crisis of belonging, a crisis of fear. There's a lot of crisis. It's not a climate crisis. The climate crisis is the manifestation of where we have come to. And so I'm really grateful to be here today and listen. I learned my mouth is shut. My grandfather always told me that. And I'm look forward to listening more from Báyò and being prompted by Alex, who has been just a wonderful host for us prior to this conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Báyò. The questions and the comments, the reactions are coming in, and I just want you to know that we are seeing them and so grateful. I've got pages of thoughts and responding to what's coming up in people's minds as they've heard so far. And actually, I just wanted Paul, the book that you have coming out, Carbon. It's not, I think it's coming out in February. Is that correct?
March, yeah.
March. So people haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I was hoping if you would just, it's so fascinating and so grateful for the review of the science that you've done. And you've named the book Carbon for a reason. And part of it has to do with trying to shift this perspective around carbon as the villain, something that we need to conquer and eliminate, which couldn't be further from the actual reality of life. And so I was wondering if you could just go a little further in terms of what it is that you are trying to point out about carbon itself, why it's special and how it represents. I mean, in some ways, reading through the book, you are lifting carbon up as something sacred, which is very counterintuitive for those who are carrying the amount of distress that so many of us are. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this carbon as villain versus carbon as flow or sacred flow.
Yeah, we have sort of made it a culprit. It's ruining our party down here. It's getting too hot, too much water, too much this. So to write the subtitle is really important, the Book of Life, as opposed to just carbon. And yes, what I did is just research it, and it's just fascinating. It's the only element that has a memory and stores energy in extraordinary ways. But the discovery of carbon is so fascinating because no one knew where it came from. It's assumed it came from the Big Bang. It did not. And eventually it was a astronomer from the UK who suggested it came from giant red stars in this little moment where two helium particles bind into beryllium, and for 1/1,000,000th of a second, while a star is basically going to explode, eventually, as a supernova, another helium molecule, basically atom, binds with beryllium and produces carbon, C12. And the odds of doing that are so spectacularly impossible that physicists, Stephen Myers at Cambridge and others, very, very well-qualified physicists, has said that the odds of life happening at all, that carbon exists, is incalculable. In other words, it's incalculably impossible. And yet here we are. And so in each cell of your body, of which you have 32 trillion, 34 trillion cells, is 1.2 trillion atoms of carbon. So what I was trying to point to is that carbon is a flow, not just any flow. It's the flow of life, and it is extraordinary. And it's really just a different way of seeing the world as opposed to objectifying it, which is what we've done to carbon. And whether it's in, the oceans and the fish and the copepods and, the plant world, the forest, our own body. I don't actually think we know where we live. And that was the discovery from writing Carbon. It's like, I thought I was brought up in a Sierra Club and all this. I thought, oh, I know where I live and this, and I can identify, different plants and forests and animals and trees and birds and this and that and so forth. I realized and I speak for everybody, we do not know where we live. And I came across this beautiful scientific paper where somebody counted the number of roots in one seed of rye. You plant a rye kernel and it becomes grass. And that grass has 14 million roots. 14 million roots that's connected to hyphae, which is connected to mycelia, which is an active, electrical network transacting with roots with everything on the planet. And again, carbon is being swapped by the rise, creating carbon, from sunshine, and then giving it to mycelia for phosphorus or nitrogen. I mean, so there's this incredible complexity and beauty of the living world, which is what I tried to really capture in the book. You can't capture it, but to point to it, to indicate it, to quote others, including Báyò, of course, but scientists, Monica Galeano and Stephen Mancuso, Zoe Slenger. I mean, there's so many scientists and writers and journalists out there who are opening this all up, and I've tried to capture some of them in the book. Yeah.
Báyò, I want to invite you to jump in here. In particular, I wonder this idea of carbon as a materiality that has both energy and memory, I feel, is something that speaks to themes that you've been lifting up.
Right.
In particular, I've heard you speak about the agentiality of cotton and sugar and the role that they play in our history that we are imbricated in. And I'm curious if you find this lifting up of a vibrant materiality of the natural world, how you think this plays into the subject, and do you feel it resonating when you are out lifting this up? Could you lean in on that?
Definitely, brother. I believe I shared with us when we're having some preparations around this that a certain philosopher said posthumanists are of no use, right? They're of no use in this time. What you need is a solution. What you need is action. And ironically, I agree with him. I agree with him that at least my brand of post-humanist intervention is particularly useless. But there's the gift. The gift is in its uselessness, is in noticing that there are particular social and material arrangements of usefulness that become so exhausted and so wrapped on themselves that they're unable to produce any kinds of futures, they're unable to generate other kinds of realities. I'm thinking about the carousel of good intentions, that was invoked by President Biden and other leaders, right? We are going to do this. We're dedicating these funds to it. People, especially that look like me, kind of have this organelle that we've sprouted over the years. It's I'm just going to be indelicate here and say it's a bullshit, detection organelle, right? We kind of we kind of understand that good intentions and the moral spaces that produce them are part of a machine that reproduces the same geometries of experience and the same logics within which climate matters are mattering, right? And this is the reason why I speak about relations or the poetics of relations in the ways that I do. This is the reason why I want to notice carbon not as the villain, because there's something that is beautifully, dangerously obscured when we exteriorize the enemy and saying, this is the thing we need to get rid of. This is the thing we need to cancel out. If we get rid of capitalism, we are fine. Let's cancel capitalism. But something about that action, that gesture, misses out on how the world slips away and spills and leaks and secretes itself, how the world churns and curdles like milk, right? It's never stable. It's not a coagulation of villains versus heroes. It's right. We are imbricated in a field that is larger than the human. And staying here, what here again means for me is a performance. Staying here is noticing how crippling and enlivening that is. That there is an ableist vocation. Here is staying with the trouble. It's not solutionistic. It is touching relationality. It is listening to carbon. It is making art with the moment, right? So, in much the same way I've started to speak about AI, that, the ways we speak about AI is like, oh, this is a tool, right? That's a very dangerous way to speak about AI, that it's just a tool that we can use. I would suggest that cognition has never truly been human, that what we rudely call cognition is ecological. Much in the same way that I would think that carbon is not a thing apart. We are imbricated and called and enlisted and entrained in its flows, so that the very attempt to cut it off and otherize it as something to villainize or reify or get rid of already calls us into repetitive loops. So carbon is cognition, it is intelligence, it is affectivity, it is future, it is the past, it is ancestrality, right? It is all the ways that the world is producing itself. And maybe the thing to do here isn't to try to get around it. It's to notice that to move through the world is to be crippled by it, right? It is to be taking apart, that there is a time to fall apart together, right? Our solutions are attempts to keep our bodies intact, but we're coming down to earth and we will not arrive intact. Maybe this story, and I shared this recently with some good folks in Lisbon. I was telling the story about two CEOs that met with me. Their names I will not disclose, and their company I will not disclose, but they're concerned about plastic and getting rid of plastic. Awesome. Great intention. They had traveled everywhere across the world, including to my country, Nigeria. And they are engendering this process that produces certain kinds of technologies that extricate plastic from the oceans, from the environment. And they had this business model around it. And then I shared with them stories. One shared with me by my sister, Andrea Panaritis, about dragons. Alex, you know this one, I think. Dragons, plastic dragons that were 5 million of which Lego toys were deposited in the waters, in the ocean, about 20 years ago, and are still coming to the shores, right? It's like our waters are proliferating plastic immigrants. And then I juxtapose that with the other story of Brazilian scientists noticing that plastic is now in our bodies, of course, has always been, microplastics in our brains, in our reproductive organs, so that in a sense, we are already too late. The idea that we can get rid of plastic, right? And then go on our merry way. I'm not suggesting this is what they thought, but that idea is very dominant. That if only we can get rid of it in the environment and get to some kind of zero state, a singularity of some kind, then we can live well. But that already is a commitment to the idea that we have been separate, that plastic is outside. No, we are thinking like plastic. We are plastic beings. We're plastic ecologies already. And to think with these times is to think with these vicissitudes, these movements. So, brother, the way that brother Paul, um, his attempt to de-villainize carbon is what makes this book so beautiful. His new book. We cannot attempt the stroking genius with a cat. We cannot attempt that heroic narrative. We have to travel and we have to be in touch somehow. What being in touch means, we have to figure out.
Paul, I just wanted to invite you to respond to anything that resonated there with you.
Yeah, I would add to the plastic, which is renewable energy. Now, that's sacred. Of course, we want renewable energy. It's called current solar income. That is, we get it every day and then we transform it into electrons. And those electrons power lights and motors and cars and whatever it is. So that's what a no-brainer, right? Well, let's think about that a little bit more. Not whether we should have renewable energy. We always have. It's called sunshine. It's called plants. So I mean, this is not a new concept, but to transform it into an electron is new. It goes back actually almost a century. So it's not a new discovery, but definitely the Chinese have really, really mastered the art of manufacturing and make it affordable. The problem with that is that, after decades of concern about energy and renewables and so forth, we're almost up to 3% of energy in the world is from renewables. Now that includes things like biofuels, which is like taking trees and pelletizing them and other ways of growing the living world and then combusting it, which causes CO2. And it's like, it's a bizarre kind of thing. And then the 3% doesn't even come close to the increase in amount of energy demand that the world has, which is being basically supplied by coal, gas, and oil, fossil fuels. And so we are in a gerbil wheel. This is not progress. This is a gerbil wheel where the faster you run, you just exhaust yourself. If you're the mouse or the rat in the gerbil wheel, you don't get anywhere. And that's where we are. And the reason for that partially is because we're not looking at demand, we're looking at supply. And of course, it makes total sense. Okay, make sure our electrons come from this directly or indirectly, but from the sun and not from 200 million year old forests, that were buried, or marine organisms that became oil. I mean, we're trying to do it in current income, but but what are we doing? What are we doing? Our consumption is just exploding. More. And so, and the most extractive industry in the world is not fossil fuels, it's Google and Meta. It's the ones who are basically burrowing in and finding out what it is we Google, what it is that we search for, what it is we're interested in, and then directing the overwhelming amount of advertising to us to get us to buy more, and to accrete. So that is extracting, and extracting from teenagers, from all of us, But not to say there aren't other extractive industries, but the fact is we came from an extractive culture. That's colonization. So we did with everywhere in the world, and we took whatever we wanted, people, place, cultures, without regard. And it wasn't just the English, it was the French, it was the Dutch, the Belgians, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and so forth. We could go on, the Germans. And we are still in that culture. And so basically, if you haven't addressed the fact that the economy is extractive and getting more so, then we can play around on the edges and say, this is a better way to do it. And it certainly is, in terms of different, plastic can be recycled, not really, but let's say it can be burned. Yeah, it can be burned. But but we are still underneath that making plastic, and where does that come from? It comes from fossil fuel. Where does the fossil fuels come from? So I think that, that's why you can't get to them here. That's why we have to go upstream. We can't solve this thing downstream. That's a really well-known environmental thing. End of pipe cleanup. It doesn't work. You have to go to where the crap is going into the pipe. Or as Bishop Desmond Tutu said, we're in the river, at the river, and people are floating down the river, and we swim out into the river, and we rescue these people, but we keep noticing people are still, being, shunted down this river by very strong currents. And the thing is to go upstream and find out who's throwing them in the river. That's how you address a problem. And we're not doing that. So the climate movement is trying to fix it. This is, and these are, again, combat, tackle, combat, all these Don Quixote verbs and, are really very male, by the way. I grew up not wanting to be like my father's peers, professors who couldn't do anything with their hands. And so I learned carpentry and electricity and motors. And, I was like, I didn't want to be like them and just live up here. But fixing is a very male thing. It's a very good thing. But we can't fix this because that's the mind that caused it.
In preparing for this conversation, in our conversations, this idea that solutionism is a problem is something that I struggled with, and I see in the comments and questions that are coming in, it's, well, but wait, what do we do? And it's a counterintuitive idea that solutions are somehow suspect, and it's helpful to be pushed and questioned at a kind of in a deep response. Paul, I remember circling a passage in your book where you said that nature, there's this idea we could plant 1 trillion trees. And you write about this, that, nature doesn't plant trees, nature grows forests. And that if the boreal forests burn, the parts per million in the atmosphere will shoot up to 600 parts per million. So this idea that if we just focus on a specific thing like renewable energy, or a specific thing like carbon capture or planting trees, it just keeps shuffling the game, and we're not actually doing anything because the interrelatedness of life is vulnerable to the violence that we do from all the angles that we're doing it. And so mycelia and fungi and earthworms and all of these protagonists that come out in your book, it was really striking. And I wonder if how you do you find yourself, there was a question, where do you think you're wrong? And I also wondered myself, what is the journey that you've been on? What convictions have you had to let go of? Because when we lift up these counterintuitive ideas, they're helpful because they knock you sideways, which I know is something Báyò likes to do. But I'm curious about how you, both in your own journey and in response to others that are feeling the crisis, that want a solution, that want to know what to do, and how you've navigated that even in your own personal journey on these issues.
Well, in terms of wrong, I've been wrong all my life. So that's not, I write because I'm curious, not because I know, or not because I'm right. And I'm very curious about where I live and the people and creatures I share this planet with. And so I hope I never stop that before, you know. But, and I also want to say I have profound respect for friends and those I don't know all over the world, and I'm in communication with them, and they're my friends who are working actively on these issues. And just, they're just extraordinary, beautiful people. I do not decry those activities. And yes, solutionism is something that's out there. I feel a little bit party to creating it with, Project Drawdown, but what I call the carbon tunnel syndrome. But the people I know who are working on regenerative agriculture, biodiversity, plastics, I mean, there's so many issues, where people are addressing it, creating NGOs and activities, and companies in some cases to address these things are extraordinary human beings. And my heart is with them all the way, and I admire them. So I don't want to be interpreted as gainsaying, activity and care and generosity. No, that's what we need more of. What I'm saying is that the meta message, like direct air capture, what you're seeing in this movement is people basically finding a way to make money off it. Now, even when the technology makes no sense whatsoever, which is direct air capture, which is to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, and liquefy it and then pump it and ship it to a geological formation, or use it to recover oil, from, which is what they're using it. Occidental Petroleum is using it for. And and the thing about direct air capture is, if I just go into the science, I mean, there's a lot of laws that maybe are questionable. The first and second law of thermodynamics may not be, which is energy runs downhill and doesn't disappear. And so direct air capture is basically using entropy to fix entropy. That is what's up there in terms of CO2 emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels is entropy. It's like the ash, if you will. And so direct air capture is trying to make a cow out of a cow patty. It's so absurd, so ridiculous, so awesomely stupid. I mean, not just like you could argue against it and so forth, that then you realize that the corporatism of the world and this, because they can make money, they're going to spend billions and billions and billions in doing this and so forth. So anyway, for me, as I said, to go back to the beginning and so forth, I'm a learner, not a knower. And that's what I try to share, is just to offer that to those who listen or read, or when we get together like today, as opposed to, but where have I been wrong? Oh my gosh, it would take hours and hours.
Báyò, what about you?
Me being wrong? Oh, I'm
You
banking on
being
it.
wrong, your journey. I know you've written about your desire for certainty, for truth with a capital T. I'm curious how you've personally navigated these questions and how to get to, the place that you're speaking from now. What have you had to let go of previously?
Arriving, um, arriving at a destination. My philosophical, spiritual contexts taught me a story. And that story was that if I kept along this pilgrimage, by and by I would arrive at a utopian arrangement. I would arrive at heaven. I will know the truth in a final way. And I understand that is very satisfying to many of us. This idea of being right or being correct in the final analysis, but no longer to me. I mean, I once traveled that path. Now I understand that it's not a binary between wrong and right. It's that the world is constantly wronging right? I'm going to put a gerund, right next to wrong and make wrong a verb instead of a noun to honor Paul's calling out of nounism, right? Is that the world is a wronging of itself. It's constantly spilling away from its own dictates, right? Which is the reason why I sometimes chuckle when I read the Enlightenment thinkers and their confidence that the world is dictated by physical laws, right? Absolute physical laws that scientists today are now saying, maybe we should rethink that. Is that the world itself, the universe, whatever you want to call it, is constantly upending its own premise. It's too promiscuous to fit neatly into categories. So it moves in the lower case, is what I like to say, not in the upper case. But I want to take several steps back and dance with this question of solutionism. That I don't think we really understand how imbricated we are in stories and algorithms that shape our experiences and anticipations and expectations about the world. We often believe that we're independent, sovereign individuals. We are making our own choices. We are making our own moves in the world. And definitely the world is divided between those who get it and those who don't, right? It's one of those binaries that are so sticky. Yeah, it's so sticky, this binary, right? It's a binary between action and indifference. So you're either in or out, right? Perhaps one of the stickiest ones is this idea of action. It's the tome, it's the trope of political action. And I just want maybe folks here to peel back through the curtains of the obvious, right? Imagine you're in the Green Emerald City and we've all arrived. And so just peel back the curtains of the obvious and ask yourself this question: who is acting when we speak about action, right? In league with solutionism, who is acting? Who is allowed to act? How does action play out? Those are some of the questions you can ask. Maybe I'll put one more in when I think about it. But think about those three for now. Who is acting? Who gets to act? And how does action play out? If you stay with those questions long enough and share it with each other like a disease or some infection, you might be led to notice that action is not as obvious as it seems. That action often shows up in different ways. Sometimes it's invisible. For instance, the molecular actions of microbes in our guts doesn't really rise to the level of a political process. It's not considered. And yet it is an outsized influence these little critters have on our thinking, on how we move in the world, on slavery, on coloniality. That action is never individual. It has never been human. Action is dispersed, rhizomatic. It looks like a lichen. It doesn't resemble the arboreal, isolated enlightenment ways we think about action. So when I hear people say, but what can I do? It feels like we are still working within the logic that it's left to us. And that is where the notion of the solutionistic comes from. This is not a way of saying we shouldn't have solutions. No, I'm not either or, that way. But it's a way of noticing that sometimes what we are doing is actually what a territory is reinforcing. Right? I'm asking us to think like territories, not units within territories. That with your great actions, your great decisions, your great activisms, I know people in the United States, we just came from the United States, that take pains to throw their trash because they're good people and they throw it in very carefully designated boxes which go to a land far away. I'm just trying to say that far away doesn't quite exist. And, people like me have known that for a long time, that being good and being, actionable and being, actionable is not the word I'm trying to summon there, but being active and being conscientious is indebted to larger territorial flows. Your good intentions notwithstanding, we live and act within principalities and powers. And that's why the invitation is for us to be in relation with a field, right? That a lot of what passes within what I have learned to call neurotypical urgent time is a perceptual regime of thought, is a perceptual stronghold that tells us if you're not acting this way, then there's something wrong with you. It proliferates all our virtue signaling performances that I am on the good side. I'm doing something about the world. I'm trying to save the planet. If we actually saved the world, people, if we saved the world, we will look in our grip at the world we've saved and to no longer be a world. It to be a dead rock. I hope we don't save the world. I hope that we learn to listen to the vibrancy, the animacy, the vitality of a world that is inviting us to become other, right? Maybe that joke, it says you cannot get there from here. Maybe the emphasis was on you. Maybe the you needs to change. The you there is a becoming other, a becoming monster, a becoming something else. Maybe in this form, we cannot perceive the amazing jaw-breaking spectacularity and tentacularity of a world that is never still. Maybe we have to become caterpillars. Maybe we have to learn to listen to autistic perceptions. Maybe we have to travel and migrate to be able to sense what the world is inviting us into. So I don't think solutions are enough. I'm not disputing the idea or I'm not saying that we don't need solutions. I'm trying to suggest that the paradigm, the milieu we're in, is inviting more than solutions, because solutions can retain the logic of the problems they're trying to upset. Rather than solutions or supplementary to the solutions, we need fields of engagement with new kinds of relations. And that might look like art, that might look like grief, that might look like holding space for the ancestral. But we and our perceptual regimes of thought need to be challenged long enough for us to shapeshift.
Yeah. I would just add to that. I mean, gosh, the only place individuals exist is in Westerns and comic books. The very fact that we think we're individuals is a mental disease. Okay, it really is. And when I think about, people say, well, what should we do? First of all, who's we? That first person plural is a very, very dangerous pronoun, because it's been used in the West to speak on behalf of the whole world, and that is not the case. Okay, but second, if we want to, and I'll say we, all of us, I mean, if we're serious about the dilemma we're in, then we have to really look at the world as a whole, as a living organism, which it is, of course, but the climate movement for decades has talked about future existential threat. This is a threat to our existence. Well, what existence, and what are you talking about? Define it. But if we're serious, then it has to be not about do and fix, but about care and grief. And there's 5 billion people wake up every morning with current existential threat. They're worried about their children, about education, about food, about warmth, about safety, about health, and so forth. In America too, by the way, not just someplace else, here in this country where I live. And if there's this a movement, upwelling, let's call it, that is serious about the whole of this extraordinary orb we call Earth, flying through space at 1,000,000 miles an hour, then we'll direct our attention to those 5 billion people. In other words, to take care. And when you're taking care of somebody else, I don't mean colonial come down there and dig wells for people and all that sort of stuff, but to really think about, so what you do during the day is uncaring or caring unintentionally. Again, for others elsewhere, go to Ghana, find out where our clothes are that we give away, throw away, and so forth. And you'll see beaches awash in our clothing and so forth. So we really have to think about really caring for each other if we're going to care for those species and those arboreal forests and so forth, and those copepods that come up every, you know, evening in oceans all over the world, they sequester more carbon than any single thing.
Hmm.
We have to just open up our hearts and realize that grief is so important here,
Hmm.
because grief is the expression of our heart.
Yeah.
And the one thing in our body that is always truthful is our heart, not our mind.
Hmm. I just want to add something quickly to that, Alex. That just this beautiful thing that was invited by Paul speaking to a turning of some kind. That when I was doing some work, my a PhD in years ago. I studied with shamans. We don't call them shamans, but they're babalawos, Yoruba healers. Something I noticed that was strange about their actions when clients presented before them, and they graciously allowed me, um, you know, they permitted me to be in their rooms when they met with people who came with different kinds of problems. Um, when they met with them, they often turned away from them. It was baffling to me because I was taught as a psychologist to isolate the ingredient that was messing up the whole psyche, focus with precision on the matter at hand, right? But they had this thing of turning away, almost like asking who else is here. I've said many times before, who else is here?
Mm.
And what they often offered to the person to do after listening to them felt not like a solution at all. It often involved the babalawo, the healer, getting up from where he was to go to tend to some wall or a tree that apparently had nothing to do with the problem. Like someone saying, "Oh, I need my business to do well in the world." And the Babalawo goes out and starts to dig into the ground. And then you interview him and say, "What are you doing?" And their responses were along the lines of, "I'm tending to the field,
Mm.
right? I'm tending to the conditionality that makes for different kinds of experiences." It wasn't, it wasn't an attack on the problem, as if problems can be neatly isolated, right? And just drawn out. It wasn't an attack on the problem. It was like scratching, making scratches in the troughs of experience so that the water of subjectivity can move differently, so that perception can misbehave, and they can see perhaps that they've always been succeeding, that their business doesn't need a new, fresh influx of money, that they've always been there. It could be that, right? So it feels to me that vocation is very Yoruba. It's very grounded in my culture. It seems that vocation is speaking to these moments that we continue to isolate and reduce to the offending ingredient, the offending thing. Get rid of that, cancel that. If we can do that, then we are left with the thing itself. We're left with a utopian arrangement. But the world is not that. The world is not that machine.
I remember and quoted Báyò in his commencement speech at the Pacific Graduate Institute, and it's a beautiful speech to read. But at the end of it, and I've given commencement speeches myself, and there's this idea that somehow you're going to give advice to these graduates that's going to help impel them into the world in a successful or meaningful way. And what he said at the end is, whatever you do after you leave here, do not try to save the world, and just consider the possibility that the world is here to save you. And I just, that figure ground shift is so important, and so beautifully stated. So I just want to acknowledge that.
I'm so glad that the conversation went here, because I think, first of all, for me, it lands this really important point that the problem with solutionism is related to saviorism, that there is this idea that we did this and we have to do this. And in fact, Báyò, last night as I was thinking about our time, I had found a page from something that you wrote in These Wilds Beyond Our Fences. You wrote that the anthropocentrism that looks out on the world and says, we did this, including the more tolerable kind that looks out on the so-called Anthropocene and sadly mutters, we did this, denies the significance of the other than human in the world's emergence. The closer we look, the more we find that we never act alone. Every small gesture is a generation of the collective. The human is a carnival of non-human doings. And I wanted to lift that up because this is a perspective that, first of all, I think it hits people from an unexpected angle to think of themselves as a multiplicity, to think of themselves as, I think in another place you write that everything we do as a murmuration.
Yeah.
But then Paul, in Carbon, you bring up a number of aspects of what's coming out in biology, in kind of the cutting edge out there, about what's referred to as the more than human world. Because there is this aspect of the dualism that presumes that there's mind and there's matter. And it usually then assigns to humans this unique place in the cosmos, as not just anthropocentrism, but exceptionalism, that we are an exception to nature and not just different from, but superior to all of plants and all of animals. But the science, Paul, that you bring into the book, I learned that plants are understood now to have 20 senses compared to 5 for animals. You talk about wasps being able to recognize individual faces of other wasps. And you talk about interspecies communication. And so for me, that makes it this uh, abstract philosophical concept very biologically tangible. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about this more than human world that we are part of and what it is that science is teaching us about things like plant intelligence and interspecies communication. I think it really shifts the frame in really important ways away from a saviorism that encourages us to think that we did this and therefore we have to do this.
Yeah, I may have sounded like a critic of science at the outset. I'm not. I think science is extraordinary. I think scientism can lead us in really odd paths and understandings and ways of seeing the world that is very narrow and bounded and rigid. But there is an explosion of, an explosion, that's probably not the right term, but of just a new crop of scientists all over the world, really sort of pouring into what I call the living world, people call it nature, um, that are making fascinating discoveries, just so fascinating. And the plant discoveries, Stephen Mancuso in Italy and Monaco Galeano, basically, yes, 20 senses, we have 5. Why? They're sessile, plants don't move. They had a different survival strategy than us. We can run around. We're mobile, whether it is a diatom or a gorilla. And so we are fashioned in a different way. And plants develop these senses, and one of them is to see, actually kind of in a chiaroscuro way, motion. In other words, motion. And things are moving in front of them or by them or so forth. And there's so many other ways that plants are perceptive and see and understand the world. But it's gotten to the point where, there's a really beautiful book called The Light Eaters by Zoe Slanger. But she spent 8 years talking to botanists, and the field of botany, like many sciences, is kind of bound by the Kunzian, paradigmatic trap, where if you're going to publish, you have to be really careful to get peer reviewed. If you're not peer reviewed, you lose your career. And so it reinforces a conservatism about what is published as accepted science. And it's the very same scientists who do very, very well, sotto voce, in other words, privately, have talked about plants in a very different way. And what they've said collectively is that if you look at the capacities of plants and how they work, for example, if you touch a plant, you just touch, like, here's my finger. If you touch a plant, the whole plant knows instantly knows that it's been touched. And that the only way you can explain a plant is to describe the whole plant as a brain, which is so extraordinary and radical. And they're saying that's the only way we, scientists, botanists, can explain it. We're not going to publish because we'll get in big trouble. So, but there's this, what I've tried to do is just point to these scientists and journalists and think that if we actually just sort of look there and receive what's happening in the world in terms of the living world, it is awesome. It is so extraordinary. It's so different than what we were taught as children, teenagers, college students, the accepted paradigmatic understanding of what biodiversity is, and we wouldn't use like really ridiculous phrases like nature positive, which is again, like, what does that mean? I know what people intend it to mean, but when you listen to it, and rather is nature like just like stunning in the fact that what we're being taught, in my opinion, is we don't know where we live. We do not know where we live. We have been taught that we do. We think we do. We want to save this and save that and do that. Yes, yes, yes. But we actually do not know where we live. And that's what's sort of emerging right now. And I think that that sense of wonder that it brings out of us, all of us, whether we're children or we're 80 years old, is something that we desperately need, so that we move away from nature or climate or this as objects, as things, more as a vast, vast reservoir of curiosity and beauty that is beyond our understanding, beyond our ken. Yeah.
It moved me in a really important way to encounter some of these aspects because it began to click for me what it is that you're trying to point to about this call to wonder and how it can make a difference. And it moved me in particularly a time with with the election and a sense of fear and grief. I just saw a comment come in that used the word horror, dealing with a feeling of horror. And so I want to kind of intentionally bring a sharp contrast here because I feel that there's a very powerful call that you both are pointing to. And at the same time, there is this question about fear and the role it should play in the climate movement moving forward. A few years ago, the brave young Greta Thunberg spoke up at Davos and said she didn't see the level of fear that she would expect from an emergency like the one facing humanity today. She didn't want platitudes. She wanted panic. She wanted us to recognize that the house was on fire and to act like it. And in response, there have been increasingly louder calls for formal declarations of climate emergency. And Báyò and I were in an event a few months ago where what was being discussed was the dangers of what happens when the forces and authorities and powers of the world begin to switch gears and start embracing climate emergency in order to exert larger amounts of control over the world, over the planet. And so that was kind of a shock for me as well. And it feels like there's a moment of confusion right now around the role of fear, and the way in which it can create an unintended authoritarianism in the politics to come. And so I'm curious, Paul and Báyò, if you could comment a little bit on this question of fear and the politics of climate emergency, because there's a lot of comments coming in about, okay, but
I think it's okay to be afraid, and it makes sense to be afraid now with the converging forces of, dare I call it, proto-fascism, or just straight out fascism.
You dare.
Rising around the world. Yes, our senses of fear are well placed. What to do with it, though, is a different matter, right? Because it is often the case that we are rushed into this, prescriptive site of reactions, right? Something about the logic of emergency shrinks the field of possibility, right? There's something about it for me that reduces the field. If you can think about a field as a menu of options, it reduces it to the gleaming red button, which we are invited time and time again to press, right? It's almost like a traumatic response. Like, let's just press that button so we can get rid of the stuff that is eliciting fear. On the other hand, I feel that fear, and again, this is embodied cognition, what psychologists are grappling with when it comes to noticing that these emotions are not mapped. They're not neural pathways that are mapped on our brains. That fear is a culture. Fear is an ecology. Is not a semiochemical phenomenon that is trapped in our brains. Instead, it's an invitation of some kind. I think that the fear produced today can actually be composted and can elicit a politics of co-responsivity. I will give one of my favorite examples and stories. I'm not going to go through the whole thing except to say that 42,000 years ago, proto-humans Neanderthals were faced with fear because the earth became orange. Like we are living in orange times today. You know what I mean? The world became troubled with a polar shift, the scientists call it, and the atmosphere was prohibitive and inhospitable, and so these people went underground. They descended into the world. Later on, scientists noticed that, or earlier on rather, they noticed that it seemed to be at the same time that cave art proliferated around the world. At the same time. And so they were able to make sense of that, noticing that there was an event. It's called the Adams trans something geomagnetic event. I forget what it's called. It's a long name. And it just is saying that there was a lot of trouble. And we went underground and we made art. The fear became a song, a vocation, a curdling of perception. It didn't lead to emergency per se. It led to a slowing down, right? A slowing down that allowed different kinds of perception to emerge. People today are still asking questions. Why did they make that art? Why did they make art when it was troubling on the surface? And I don't know that we can answer that question from where we are. I think we would need to shapeshift as well to sense what they sensed. So maybe this is just my roundabout way of suggesting that I wouldn't get rid of fear either. That fear could be an ally. It could be something we're being called to embrace, to walk alongside. Maybe the fear is teaching us to distrust our notions of victory. Maybe the grief of this moment is inviting us not to be so welcoming to established notions of power as we have been. Maybe we're being invited to seek power in other spaces, to seek power in other ways, to press our hands and our feet and our ears on the surfaces of things, to be in vocations of touch. And maybe by doing so, we release ourselves from the saviorisms that led to the transatlantic slave trade that is proliferating the Anthropocene and is giving birth to the emergencies which are not disconnected from fascism. That the thing to do is to allow fear to work with us instead of allowing it to be the villain once more. Yeah, I'll stop there for now.
Paul, is this the angle that you would take as well?
Well, I often am asked, am I hopeful? And I say, no.
I asked you that question.
Yeah. And I said, no, absolutely not. And and people, when I say that, kind of like get downcast, like, well, if you're not hopeful, you know. But what I say is that hope is, in my opinion, the pretty mask of fear. In other words, it masks fear, and that what we want to touch into is the fear itself, and not mask it or cover it up with a kind of hopefulness. And that what we need is courage, not hope. And courage is something that is courage the heart. That is innate, I think, in everyone. And finding it sometimes is difficult, you know. But that's where we need to go. And when we're acting from our heart, we can certainly be very cognizant of threats of it is fascism, proto-fascism. There's no question about it. It's the Reichstag all over again in the world, but this time in a very strange and distorted way from a extraordinary narcissist who's become president of the United States. And so I just I see all these things as tools, as allies, not as like you know, that thing about may you live in interesting times, you know. I mean, okay, you're here. And so I remember once a student, after I gave a talk, said, you know, was very concerned and this and about the future. And I said, you know, you may not be Buddhist but you know, there is this idea that people come to Earth, you know, they've been here before, that they arrive, you know, and so forth. And I said, you've chosen this extraordinary time to be alive. I can't think of a time that is on Earth historically, from what we know, that is more extraordinary than now. And so, you know, it's just delicious. And it is horrific at the same time. Of course, it's horrific, and ignorant, and selfish, and greedy, and aggressive, and thoughtless, you know, and both are true. All are true at the same time. And so I feel like what Báyò was saying, take the fear as food. It's food, and it's justified. It means we're alert, awake, alive, and listening and watching. And but go beyond it. Don't stay there, go beyond.
I appreciate you bringing hope up, Paul, because it is that was I asked that question of you. I was looking for hope. And it's not just you. I've heard in recent weeks, just hope as hubris, hope as vacuous, as palliative, as an opiate. And your response has really stuck with me about pointing to courage, to joy. Um, a number of people have asked about blessed unrest, and I wanted to invite you to just talk a little bit about that because there are also questions about, okay, is this a spiritual transformation we're looking for? And is that going to be slow enough? Is that going to be powerful enough? And so we're not talking about a lack of action, although Báyò, you speak about post-activism. And so I just wanted to lean further into this. If it's not hope we're looking for, what is and what would the difference look like out there in these networks of care that you've pointed to?
Well, I'm not sure I do or don't truly appreciate the question as if I knew, because I do not. I appreciate the being honored as if I did, but I absolutely have no idea where this leads, where it goes. And I would say that, you know, my next book, which I'm writing right now, is really about the 3.4 trillion creatures that inhabit the earth besides ourselves. And what we know now and didn't know until relatively recently, they're all communicating. All 3.4 trillion creatures are in communication. Okay, every cell in your body, okay, all 30 plus trillion are in communication. There's sensors on every cell, and they're transmitting information, receiving information, whatever you want to call it, signals, and so to me, leadership and is listening to all the voices. And I remember living in Japan, studying there, and the Shinto is the ancient, it's not really a religion, but it's certainly a way of life, a way of living, a way of thinking, a way of being in the world. But the emperor has this beautiful, on his black kimono, this beautiful 16 petal symbol, which is actually a chrysanthemum. And 2 times 8, which is duality times infinity twice. I mean, it's got all sorts of meanings, but kiku is the name of a chrysanthemum in Japanese. And kiku means to listen in Japanese. And so, in a sense, I mean, it was like, if you're going to be the emperor, preside, so forth, you have to listen to all the voices. And I feel like we haven't. And now we are being offered by science, by Asa Raskin and the Earth Species Project and so many other things, people, scientists, discoveries and so forth, the ability at least to recognize that the whole of the world is far more complex and beautiful than we ever understood. But it is also communicating. And that is what makes it all work, is that it's not isolated. Creatures don't keep to themselves, there's cross-species communication. There's just this beautiful flow of intelligence in the world that surrounds us. And this crisis, this situation, is an invitation for us to join that flow.
Okay. Yeah. I'm hearing the questions and I'm feeling into it. And the way that I feel invited to respond to it now is to suggest that I don't know that we even know what hope looks like, brother. I think the way that we have conversations about hope often puts it in contrast with hopelessness. Again, binaries are very comfortable, they're convenient. I don't know that that's how I would see it. There's this very brief example that comes to mind as a radicalization of agency, accountability, hope, all the things that we kind of cherish as unique and exclusive to humans. There's a town in Brazil called Laguna where the fishermen come out and in the morning they stand still in the waters. They don't move. They just stand absolutely still with their fishing nets and they don't do anything for a while. And then all of a sudden, a few feet away from them, a dolphin comes out and they immediately know what to do. They shuffle back and forth and they move here and there. And before you know it, the fish that they're looking for comes to them. They don't even have to swing anything. The dolphins have formed an interspecies relationship with these people in Brazil, right? Across that lake, there is another town that has all the equipment, probably PhDs alongside on how to fish, but they don't catch any fish, right? Something about the relationship with these people and the dolphins creates the right conditions for their abundance, the abundance that they generate, which is my own way of saying that I don't know that we even understand what the new is, right? A lot of what we name and speak to is actually incarcerated in, like I said earlier on, perceptual regimes. When we speak about the new, we're mostly speaking about innovation, for instance. Innovation, the shiny, you can gain more mastery with innovation. It seems the territory of innovation has co-opted the new. So when we're looking for change, at some subatomic level, we're gesturing out for innovation. That's the reason why we would speak about a new iPad as new, but we would never speak about a pandemic as new, right? Because innovation bends the language so that it honors a part of experience to the exclusion of other parts of our experiences. I don't know that we know what hope looks like. I think hope is still in formation. I think hope is teenage. It's still awkward. It's still forming into itself, right? We don't know what leadership looks like. A lot of what we think leadership is what Obama-esque figures do, right? In Polaroid moments, or what's that? Right? It's what figures do on TV screens. And then we call that leadership. Most of us, I guess. But I think leadership is yet to come. The new is yet to come. Our theories of change need to be upended, broken open, so they can serve emergence in other ways. So, brother, I think that it's not a question of whether we should abandon hope or not. I just feel the shapes of hope that we've committed ourselves to are exhausted because they fastened themselves so assiduously to an image of victory, an image of coming out on top, an image of survival. And maybe hope wants to travel differently. Maybe hope wants to go elsewhere. Maybe hope doesn't want to go to the sunset. Maybe hope wants to go underground. And maybe it's not a question of a pure category of hope against a pure category of hopelessness. Maybe hope needs hopelessness in order to be itself. And in order to embrace hope, we have to be in league with failure, with not getting it right, with uncertainty, with not knowing what to do, with saying, I have no idea. And there's something about that allows a stranger politics to emerge, brother.
Thank you for that. We are coming into a closing, and Báyò, you've said, there are no neat arrivals, and we will not arrive intact. I am not arriving intact at the end of this conversation, but I appreciate the ways in which both of you are challenging certain leaps that are made without examination in the emotional and intellectual processing of the times we're in. Báyò, you wrote, which I thought was helpful to share, that you are inviting us to consider that discomfort is a holy ally, a redeeming interruption, where you are most confused, exhausted, distressed, and compromised is where the wild things grow. And I found that to be a really important questioning of whether it is despair and hopelessness
Mm,
that I'm feeling or
mm,
discomfort and
mm,
fear
Mm.
that is provoking the need to do something, to
mhm,
to find my way into actions and networks of care. Um,
mhm,
Paul, we spoke a little bit about whether you might close us with a reading from the book that's coming out. And so I wanted to invite you to do so. And then, Báyò, I'll invite you to offer any response or closing words to that. And then we will go out into the world and act courageously and with joy. But Paul, did you have a passage that you thought would be appropriate for the moment?
Have a passage that you suggested. I will begin it. Yeah. People sense something momentous is happening. Barry Lopez wrote, "We feel ourselves on the verge of something vague but extraordinary. Something big is in the wind and we feel it. We know that if we mean to make this a true home, we have a monumental adjustment to make. We must turn to each other and sense this is possible." End of quote. Change and wonder, doubt and fear walk hand in hand. This is the nameless era. It was predicted, but the common fate of prophecy is to be ignored. The juggernaut institutions laying waste to sea, land, and people cannot endure. Top-down solutions for saving life on Earth are well intended, but will fail because nature is not top-down. A beginning is near a threshold, and so too is an end. Without fail, meaningful change begins with one person, one idea, an aspiration, one audacious dream. Uniqueness is your birthright. It is the seed of community. Plant it and see what happens. Pessimism and gloom are cobwebs, brush them aside. We seek a rapprochement with our mother, the earth, the vast and mysterious primordial intelligence that steadily gives birth to all that exists, that sustains all that is. Do we cherish it or lose it? You can't be both cautious and courageous. We must choose. Focus on what is in front of you. Give yourself permission to fail. Leave room for foibles and humor, dancing and giggles. Find restorative movements you can sing and dance to, lest creation plays to an empty house. Beliefs do not change our actions. Actions change beliefs. Complex realities begin as simple acts: enchantment, humility, respect, imagination, and constant gratitude, which offer wider apertures to the living world. Monica Galeano suggests we stop playing God and instead play midwife. We can't save the planet, it will save itself. It is innately regenerative. We are invited to honor the world that is in front of us. The living world is our best friend. And where you are is where you are most effective. The power to act does not lay elsewhere. Fundamental human rights and needs must be met. Everyone on earth comes first. There is no second. Revive, honor, and nourish the wild and bountiful lives that forever astonish us with their splendor and grace. The movement to restore life on earth is not a repair job. It is transformative, an entirely new experience of self, the visceral awareness that our life is coincident with every being on the planet. Our intention and our reward are the same: to experience and express the irrevocable connection to all beings. It is our only way forward.
Thank you, brother. Thank you very much, brother. And um, I will leave us with this sentiment, this consideration. My first love was actually clinical neuroscience. That's what I wanted to go to school to study, not psychology. Psychology was several steps down the ladder of my ambition. And of course, back in Nigeria, we didn't have the technology to do that, or the people to hold that vocation. So I settled for psychology. But when I was writing in my own nerdish journals what I wanted to do, and this would excite you, Alex, because we are co-theologians in process, in the search of process in its processing. I wrote for myself this vocation of finding the soul. I wanted to prove that the soul exists. I felt that I could do it by studying the brain, and that's what I did day and night, right? That if I could go further than René Descartes, I could peel away the layers of the brain and finally show everyone, this is us, stripped away from all the drama and all the neurosis. This is us, right? This is what I wanted to do. Of course, by and by, I found that this was a terrible idea, and that the soul wasn't within or without, it was between. That the soul is not a coherent thing. We don't find ourselves in ourselves. We are not possible without the others, right? This is not just social psychology. This is not just even psychology. This is the holobiont in biology, right? It's the idea that we need the other to be ourselves. We are chimeric in that way. So when we say that when we suggest, and I hope this has been clear, among other things we've said today, that the most electrifying vocation of these times of fire and brimstone aren't, tied up with proliferating innovation. They're tied up with querying and composting perception. We're trying to suggest that we don't live here. We have lived in a concrete dome, a glass building called there, provisionally, and there is locked up. There is a Kafkaesque establishmentarian structure. And what it's trying to do is to turn away from here, because here is too overwhelming. We cannot take it all in. And so we turn away and we practice this there-ness, this logic of separation. And we tell ourselves we are ensouled within ourselves. We are by ourselves, all in ourselves. If we're exclusive, we owe our exclusivity to ourselves. And in doing so, we have dumped here away, so that we don't even know how to be present anymore. So in that sense, maybe the politics of power that figures in the Anthropocene teaches us to notice the cracks in there, through which we can have a glimpse of here. And then we can gesture outwards. We can meet the other creatures that have always been part of what we're doing, so that we can no longer think about moral accountability without inviting the world outside, the world that we've exteriorized. Maybe that is why the Igbo slaves captured in the 19th century, maybe this is why they had a confidence that they could travel back to Africa, despite their colonizing, captors mocking their attempts to fly back. The story goes that they turned into birds and flew back to Africa. I don't care what history says. That's the one I want to believe, that they flew back to Africa. They turned into big black obsidian birds and flew back to Africa. Maybe that is what we're talking about. It's not a spiritualizing vocation. It's not a bypass. It's an invitation for us to notice that the earth is surprising. Its most powerful project is surprise. We've just learned to be desensitized to its vocations. So our politics has to look like that, has to look like us meeting here as if for the first time. And that might look like becoming birds. But whatever it is, let us try. encourage to meet at that place of the crack. That's about it.
That's so great.
Paul and Báyò, thank you. Thank you for the words. I am moved. I am troubled. I am enervated to be involved and to push forward further. I want to thank everyone that has joined us for your comments, for your questions. I hope that you have felt a part of this conversation in the words and the questions that have been lifted up, thanks to the gifts that you have offered. Thank you, everyone, for being here together in this time, in this moment. May we go out into our world today and be part of that great sacred dance of life. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Alex.
you.